Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new edition of the Daily Debate. In tonight's show, we're going to be talking about Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry, who is currently in New York heading the Egyptian delegation for the UN Security Council. The council is headed by Egypt for this round. We're also going to be talking about this council, this meeting, shedding light on fighting terrorism and all the challenges facing the UN Security Council for this round. Also, we're going to be talking about the terrorism, combating terrorism in general, whether inside Egypt or outside of Egypt. We're going to be tackling all these files in tonight's edition of the Daily Debate. But before we start, let me welcome our distinguished guest, Ambassador Mohammed Anis Salim, the member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, let's check out this report regarding Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry actually heading the delegation in New York for the UN Security Council of Egypt, and we'll be right back.
Sameh Shoukry traveled to New York on Monday for a three-day visit to head the Egyptian delegation at the UN Security Council sessions, including a meeting on counter-terrorism next Wednesday. Shoukry will participate in the Council's open debate at the ministerial level about fighting the ideological discourse of terrorist organizations, which the Foreign Minister's spokesperson, Ahmed Abu Zaid, described as the most important event in which the Foreign Minister will be participating. According to a Foreign Ministry statement, the session will be attended by the foreign ministers of the member countries of the Security Council, in addition to the rest of the members of the UN, a session which was initiated by Egypt, as Egyptian Amr Abdel Latif is the Council President for May. In a press briefing, Abdel Latif has said that Shoukry would participate in the open debate on threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts on May the 11th. The Foreign Minister will also hold bilateral meetings with his counterparts from Hungary, the Netherlands, Argentina, Norway and New Zealand, the Danish UN General Assembly President Jens Lykke-Toft, and a number of candidates for the post of Secretary General. Shoukry will attend a high-level discussion of the General Assembly on activities required to consolidate peacekeeping and peace building. A meeting with UN Arab Group will also be held with Shoukry in order to discuss a number of issues on the Security Council agenda, as Egypt is currently the Arab Group representative at the Security Council. The top diplomat also sits for interviews with foreign newspapers and news agencies.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and now starting our discussion with Mr. Ambassador. Your Excellency, now Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry is taking part in the UN Security Council in New York for 3 days. Generally, what would you say are the main topics being discussed in the agenda of the Egyptian delegation for this UN Security Council?
There is an agenda for work for the Security Council for the whole month of May. And as you know, the chairmanship rotates every month from one country or member state of the Security Council to the next. This month is quite rich. It covers issues like follow up on some of the long-standing crises in the world, like the Middle East, for example. Also other things like Liberia, Somalia. There's going to be a Security Council mission to update on the situation in Somalia. Other issues, one of them is the issue of looking at peacekeeping operations. Egypt played a very important role in some of the preparatory meetings towards the Security Council review of peacekeeping operations. There is also a very important review in the General Assembly that will be taking place shortly. So together, all of these issues gives you a very, very wide range of international problems which the Security Council is seized with.
Yes. Well, before we start delving into the main issues that will be discussed for this round, now the last time Egypt was heading the UN Security Council was in 1996, which is about 20 years ago. So how different do you think the Egyptian participation will be in the UN Security Council? We have a non-permanent seat now. which was in a way a landmark to actually get it after all the past few years of political uncertainty and turmoil. How different do you think the Egyptian performance will be this time around compared to 1996?
The technicalities of chairing don't give you that much room to influence the debate. The change has happened in the way the world has changed. That the issues, for example, if you look at the issues of the Middle East, one of the very significant things when you look at the agenda of work of the Security Council is that Middle East issues are taking a lot of time and space. And it's significant, I think, that Middle East issues have occupied the world for such a long period of time and have taken on a characteristic of being difficult to resolve. So you see issues that are not going away, that were in fact on the agenda of the Security Council now for ages. Somalia, for example, Liberia, or Darfur. All of these issues are, or of course the Middle East, of course, goes without saying. So one of the very significant things is this inability of the Security Council to actually resolve some of the long-standing conflicts. Now, what we're seeing also in the way the UN works is that there's more concentration of power in the Security Council vis-a-vis compared by the General Assembly. And this is not really the way the founding fathers of the organization looked at it. They saw it much more as a democratic institution open to all states, an institution that would take a leadership role in resolving issues of peace and security. We're not seeing that happen. We're seeing that there is a certain weakness of resolve. We're seeing also that a lot of issues are being tackled outside the Security Council, outside the United Nations. So there is a need for a big reform process. This is a complex issue. It will not be resolved during the period where Egypt is a member of the Security Council, but it's one that we should be taking an interest in and also helping to resolve.
Yes. Well, you've pointed out to a very common criticism of the UN institution in general and the UN Security Council, which is not really taking decisive or concrete steps or decisions that would be applied in the political life worldwide. And Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry actually noted today saying that the way things are being, decisions are being made and things being dealt with within the UN Security Council should witness a real change. Do you think that we will witness any sort of real change? Because, as you've mentioned, a lot of decisions are being taken and implemented outside of the UN body. And at the same time, approaching a new era with a new Secretary General, do you think things will change?
A lot of change is linked to the consensus of opinion between the 5 permanent members. And this is a difficult relationship because there are a lot of global conflicts between those, and it's difficult for them to reach a consensus. When they do reach a consensus, things can move quickly. Look at Syria. That, you know, the fact that the US and Russia have managed to get together has given an impetus. It's difficult, it's frustrating, but there is a political process that has been absent for the last 5 years. Whether we can replicate that in other complex issues, for example, the Middle East, for example, Yemen, for example, Iraq, can we do this, or whether we cannot, this is it's difficult to predict. We need to keep trying. We need to see also where is it that we can move forward within our regional context. Is it possible, for example, to establish Arab peacekeeping operations using the expertise of the United Nations? Is it possible to use Arab observer forces? Is it possible to create zones of peace in the region? Is it possible to create mediation bodies? How can we engage more and more with our own region? Because if you look at some of the issues in the Middle East, you'll see that there is an absence of an Arab role. If you look at the mediators, for example, on the different conflicts in the Middle East, they are all from the United Nations. Non-Arab, with the exception of one, the one working on Yemen. But you will look at people, even if you look at issues like the internal situation in Yemen, in Lebanon, I'm sorry. Where is the Arab role in this? There needs to be an Arab role. If you look at for example, the confrontation with Daesh, it's very difficult to find a clear regional Arab role. There was a symbolic Arab role at a certain stage, and then it diminished and vanished. Where is the initiative? Where is the resolution really to tackle this? That needs to materialize.
Yes. Well, Egypt now heading the UN Security Council for this month. Everyone's really was really excited about Egypt getting the non-permanent seat. But do you feel that not necessarily at least this month, but in general, do you think that obtaining this seat, we will be actually able to really shed the spotlight on a lot of the Arab and African issues that would be of great importance to the African continent within the UN? Or do you feel that it's mainly a formality or a ceremonial post for everyone in Egypt and around the Middle East to celebrate? Do you think that when Egypt is heading now the UN Security Council, can we actually force any sort of decision making? It obviously has to deal with the 5 permanent members, but do you feel that Egypt now has a lot of influence, a really big role by an Arab country within the UN Security Council?
As I said before, the Security Council, we're talking about 15 member states, with 5 having a very special role because they have a veto power over whatever decision. Yes. So if there's any decision they don't like, they can stop it right there. So by necessity, you are a member of a big team. To what extent can you bring new angles in this, new perspectives, new ideas, new proposals? Not too much, because the agenda of work is shaped by years and years of follow-up and issues that have been opened and formulated and institutionalized by certain ways. So you have, for example, sanctions that are in place against the country A. Then you have a sanctions committee that is reporting to the Security Council on the implementation of these sanctions and whether these sanctions should be renewed or discontinued. So you have so many other instruments. If you look at the agenda of work, you'd be surprised at the number of follow-up steps on former previous resolutions. So there isn't that much of room for you, but you have an area of perspective. For example, the discussion of tomorrow, which is about the narrative and the ideology of terrorist operations. This is an area which Egypt feels, Egypt has an interest in this. It has pushed this issue to bring it to the Security Council. It has a say because it has expertise in understanding that terrorism is not only the terrorist act, but there is a narrative that leads to the emergence of terrorist organizations, to the recruitment of young people within countries, to the recruitment of what's called foreign fighters who are brought from other countries to join conflicts and to commit terrorist acts. There is a historical narrative. We know that it goes back to writings of people like Maududi and Sayyid Qutb and so on, and there are different organizations. Egypt understands this. It has an experience with it. It also knows about the de-radicalization programs where terrorists have been trained to de-radicalize, to forego their former ideology of extremism and to join the main discourse of democratic politics. So many of the experiences that Egypt has will be relevant for the debate that's taking place. These can be reflected eventually in decisions like, for example, whether organization A, B, or C will be listed as a terrorist organization, and whether different states will take actions, concrete actions against members of these organizations, or to stop the activities, or to stop supporting, or to be careful about what happens when you start a TV station, for example, that is carrying messages that are strengthening this narrative. So I think these kind of issues are areas where Egypt can have an influence.
Yes. Well, the UN Security Council has 15 member states. Now, talking about the most influential, the 5 permanent members, Egypt, we've seen over the past year or so that Egypt has been really strengthening its ties with countries such as Russia, China, France, and these are countries that seem to be on maybe the same wavelength and on the same page as Egypt in regards to how to fight and combat. As you've mentioned, Egypt has a lot of the know-how to really stop the emergence, at least, or backtrack the emergence and the radicalization of these groups. But what about other member states that we're not quite sure how they would stand? Because you said that nobody has seen still a strong Arab coalition that could be fighting extremism and the terrorism around the world, not just the Middle East, but also because we've seen the terrorist acts happen all over the world in European countries and in the Western community as well. Do you feel like countries such as the US administration, are they on the same wavelength as Egypt and Russia and China and France, and actually how to combat the extremism, or is there another agenda that we should be worried about? Do you think they could veto some sort of a decision that might be taken by the UN Security Council for this month?
I don't think you have anything that's that controversial that will be take you to a veto. Also, the work method of the Security Council is now designed to avoid vetoes. But I think that this kind of dialogue creates areas of consensus, of growing consensus. Incidentally, I don't think that there's 100% kind of agreement with all of the 5 members between us and any, and the countries you mentioned. There will always be areas of divergence. But the thing is, can you focus on the principal areas where you can designate, for example, who is a terrorist and who isn't a terrorist? There has been a historical problem in defining terrorism. There has been a problem in pragmatic issues like which organization inside Syria should be part of the peace process and which should be marginalized, which should be part of a ceasefire and which should not. Eventually, which will be subject to sanctions and international law in the future, because there must be accountability for these acts. One day there will be accountability for all these acts of terrorism, and who should stand trial and who should not. So there are a lot of issues that will come out. I think the dialogue is useful. I think it's important to be open-minded and progressive, but it's also important to understand the mindsets of many of the countries we are dealing with. If you look at the West, for example, you would see that there is a narrative now in the West that the idea of external intervention has not succeeded. It has not succeeded with the Russians in Afghanistan. It has not been a great success story for the Americans in Afghanistan. It has been a disaster for the Americans in Iraq. It has been not very good for the Europeans leading the charge in Libya. Now, this has led to a huge amount of hesitation to have boots on the ground. That the public opinion in the West doesn't want to see new wars and doesn't want to see coffins coming home. Now, how do you face the reality of terrorism in situations like this? How do you face the reality of Daesh, for example, in Libya? Obviously, the emerging government is not seizing authority that fast. It will be very optimistic to expect them to deal with Daesh on their own. What degree of foreign or international intervention will be able to address this? How will it happen? Within what time spectrum? Under what conditions? What kind of regime will you have once you finish an operation? All of these are issues which are very open, and they're difficult for Western countries, they're difficult also for the Arab world, because the Arab world doesn't know what to do about it.
Yes, well, as you've mentioned, if they've seen that the foreign intervention has not been a successful story in all of these places, do you think that they could change their mindset and say, well, maybe the Arabs should fix it? I mean, they would know how to deal with it better. But then again, if an Arab coalition actually intervened in crises such as what's happening in Syria or Libya, afterwards, do you think the Arab countries will be able to help a government stand up and be recognized and take matters of their country in their own hands?
Well, you know, the problem here is really a problem of capacity. If you look at the Arab League today, it doesn't have the tool set to address this. It doesn't have a security of taking decisions on security issues. It doesn't have a military mechanism. It doesn't have much experience in peacekeeping. If you compare that, for example, to the African Union, you'll see that the African Union has at least tried to work in Burundi. It tried to work in Somalia. It tried to work in Darfur. And it worked because it brought in the expertise of the United Nations. It got support from the EU. And it created a joint force and managed to intervene. I don't see the Arab world getting on this track at all. So we have a problem of capacity. And this process of building capacity has to start someday. We've been very late at addressing this issue.
Well, we've mentioned the UN and the UN Security Council not really being as effective as the whole world would want it to be. Also, the Arab League didn't really live up to the expectations of taking the Arab matters into their own hands and actually achieving some sort of progress. So how effective, how important is it for these summits and these meetings and these international bodies to actually make a difference in the world? Or should we mainly rely on individual countries or some sort of coalitions being formed between different groups of countries to actually make a difference?
There is a trend in the world, not only in the Arab world, but it's very clear in the Arab world, of creating temporary coalitions. Coalitions of the willing, if you like. If you look, you'll see Russians, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and the Iranians putting together a coalition around the issue of fighting Daesh. You'll see another coalition which has been put together with under the leadership of Americans to fight Daesh. You'll see a lot of bilateral pacts. You'll see the Turks with the Qataris, the Turks with the Saudis. I think that's a trend which will continue. But meanwhile, you see that regional organizations that have a basic function in terms of in their region at least, are failing in their duty. And where do you stop this trend? Where do you start the repair process? And how do you do it? I would say you need also to go step by step. I think the step that was proposed last year of creating a joint Arab force has not worked because it was too ambitious. You need to go the gradual. It will be slow, but at least you're on a winning curve. And that's much better than this stop-start issue. Whether you can, you pose a very good question about whether these temporary coalitions could play a role in fixing the system. And I think you have a good point there. Definitely the Egyptian-Saudi relation has this potential. It has the joint Arab force has stopped because of Saudi objections. Saudi Arabia has led the intervention in Yemen. I'm not sure to what extent, this is managed in an effective manner. Saudi Arabia has called for an Islamic coalition. I'm not sure to what extent this is in line with Egyptian policy. Egypt's policy has always been to work within the Arab context. The idea of Arab nationalism, the Arab League, these were the Egypt when it comes particularly to issues of peace and security. So there is some problem here that if the main players in the region cannot agree on the basics of the problems and how to address them, then somehow these temporary coalitions also will have a problem.
Yes. Well, talking about combating terrorism, a Middle Eastern problem, but also a global one. We've seen a lot of attacks taking place in Belgium, taking place in Paris. So within these sessions for this month, it won't be just Arab countries and Egypt proposing ideas and ways to fight and combat terrorism, but also Western countries such as the US, such as France, Russia. These countries, they will probably also have some ideas that they would want to propose for this session. We've seen the NATO coalition, we've seen the airstrikes carried out by the United States and Russia, but not really tangible, concrete solutions that have been achieved. What sort of ideas do you expect these countries to propose to?
If you look at the kind of background to this, if you look to the issues like previous Security Council resolutions, some of the reports that were prepared by the Secretariat in preparation for some of these discussions in previous sessions of the Security Council, some of the concept papers. Now, one of the interesting mechanisms that the Security Council is that a certain state, a member state, will present a concept note to inform the discussion. This concept note is not necessarily reflective of the consensus of the Council, but is meant to be an instrument to assist the discussion. And if you look at this material, you'll see some of Western thinking on these issues. For example, one of the issues that the West has been very keen on is that fighting terrorism does not mean transgressions on human rights. For example, that's one of the issues. You will hear voices countering this and saying that this is not realistic, that in practice it's so there is a you will see issues where some states will say that for us a certain organization is a terrorist organization and should not be touched by others. For example, what the Turks are saying about PKK. That this Kurdish movement for the government in Ankara is seen as a terrorist organization. Meanwhile, other parties, for example, the United States, a member of NATO, a close ally of Turkey, is supporting PKK because they say PKK is a main ally in the fight against Daesh. So issues are more complex. I would say that sometimes I'm worried about the way issues are presented in the Egyptian media, because they are often presented as black and white issues where so-and-so is against us and so-and-so is running a conspiracy against us. But I think go deep into issues, because the issues are much more complex than they appear, and often the answers are not so simple.
Your Excellency, one issue has been always being discussed in the UN and the UN Security Council, which is the Palestinian issue. Now, in light of yesterday's meeting between President Sisi and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, and also Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas met with Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry, do you think that Egypt can do something about it while heading the UN Security Council? Do you think that there is some sort of a new angle, at least, to tackle the Palestinian cause, or is this an ongoing soap opera that we will be witnessing with no real concrete solutions taking place?
If you look at the Palestinian issue and try to identify what are the new factors in the next few weeks, you'll see that the issue of the quartet presenting its report, and the expectation that the report will be, on the one hand, more critical of Israeli settlement policy, but opening the door for a search for a new dynamic to push the figure. You also see the French talking about putting together a new initiative, even if the are not willing to cooperate with this. And the question is, can some of the mechanisms we have seen used to energize the Syrian negotiation, can some of these mechanisms be replicated in the way the Middle East issue is being tackled? Can there be a meeting of states, not necessarily in the conflict, so a meeting where not attended by the Israelis and the Palestinians, something similar to what happened in Vienna I and Vienna II on Syria before the Geneva conference was reconvened. That is a possibility. Is there a possibility of holding a special session on the Security Council with issuing a new mandate? That's one dynamic. The other dynamic, always when you talk about the Palestinian issue, is where will the American administration be vis-a-vis that kind of initiative? You have a president who's a lame duck, who is thinking of his legacy and how he will depart the picture. I see today, I was reading that he has decided to go, which is a historical step for any American. It has unprecedented, and it is a huge step in the global context of reconciliation between peoples. But I do not see a huge willingness in the remaining months of this presidency. Who will be the next president? Whether that president will want to indulge in the Middle East or whether to continue with the Obama policy of disengagement, these are open questions. So there is always the question with the, going back to the French initiative, is this on water and waste time while there is the shift of power in Washington? Some Europeans are saying that any new American president will need to become more engaged in the Middle East, will need to discontinue the Obama policy of
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll definitely be following up the developments taking place over the next 2 days in New York at the UN Security Council, where Egypt is heading the month of May round for the Council. And before we go, I'd like to guest Ambassador Mohammed Anis Selim, the member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's time to head to our next topic of tonight, talking about actually fighting terrorism in Egypt and a little bit outside of its borders. Let's check out this report regarding many reports say that a lot of terrorists have fled Sinai Peninsula and went to Libya, and we'll be right back.